Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you everybody for coming out to be at this presentation today and for taking the time to spend some time on foundational controls. There we go. So what I wanted to do was go back and take a look at some of the controls that are very common in the security space, and really address one of the issues that we've seen come up from multiple aspects. That we tend to get caught up in this idea that we're chasing the shiny new object, the latest thing that might be out there. And when we do that, we sometimes get away and forget about the importance of building a very solid foundation from a security perspective, and then that's really the key for being successful at being able to develop some of the higher level, higher value security controls that would sit on top of it. If you chase the shiny new object, there really is no silver bullet. So if you aren't paying attention to the really fundamental controls, you definitely are leaving yourself open for A, disappointment, and B, potentially significant risk or risk of breach or consequences from that. So moving on. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's take a look at the nature of controls that we would have in a security framework. And for this purpose, we've really broken them out in terms of the basic core elements that really need to be a part of any security program. So the most basic elements are those that deal with things like vulnerability management, configuration compliance, in developing an inventory of the assets that we have on the network. You really can't manage the things that we don't know about. On top of that, we have a set of foundational controls that we'll call them, and that deals with things like, the basic processes that are necessary on top of. So vulnerability management, we might go out and be able to detect things. When we build the control on top of that, we actually want to be able to patch and effectively deal with the things that we're finding. So when we've built up a very solid foundation of integrity management, file management, secure configuration, vulnerability detection, change management, then we've really got the building blocks in place that on top of which we can actually start to build out the more advanced operational items. And of course, as we're doing this, many customers have had to evolve their environment to really address both the on-prem environment and to a much greater extent going forward. We're of course starting to see much greater emphasis on the introduction of cloud-based technologies. So as we move up, we do see a significant amount of investment, and as the maturity increases, we're able to move up this triangle of needs and capabilities to really address some of the newer technologies that are there. So we're not alone in this particular position. We can look to a message that Gartner has been promoting actually now for several years, that the analyst is quoted as saying, new technology interesting, but not all of, but not at the expense of the basic controls. Look at the simple, fast, and relatively easy things to do that you should revisit. The data shows that actually it'll put a big dent in the problem. So that was a Gartner view of actually emphasizing the importance of having the critical security controls in place. And have we done a good job at it? I would just look to the latest Verizon data breach report. So that's a report that's put out every year by Verizon, and it's actually going through an investigation of the breaches that occurred in the, well actually it's worldwide, but they actually have gone through, traced when the first indications were that somebody had been breached to the actual disclosure and the investigation of what the root cause might have been. But we are seeing that, we're still seeing very long times from the point at which a breach may have, or that an intrusion may have occurred, to the point that we're actually realizing that a breach has occurred. So that's a really key indicator that the foundational controls really aren't in place. If we had effective intrusion detection capabilities, we should be able to bring the breach detection much, much closer to the actual point of intrusion or the underlying issue that was there. Also, if we're effective at secure configuration management and vulnerability management, then we should actually be able to reduce the surface area and prevent some of those breach activities that have occurred. So if we want to try and map it to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, typically the security side are mostly concerned about the confidentiality side, and operations is typically more concerned about the availability side. And integrity is kind of that thing in the middle that is a bit more nebulous, and actually we have a quote here from Wired.com where they've actually called it out, that the integrity part is what does it really mean, and how do you measure, how do you do that. So really, if we take a look at the things that contribute to integrity, it's really about knowing what's out there on your network, knowing how secure it is, detecting when it changes, knowing how it changes, and as a consequence of doing all those activities, we'll actually be able to gather information like a very accurate inventory. We'll be able to detect and correct integrity drift, like when we're actually seeing things that might have been compliant initially, but then as we continue to update, manage those systems, people change them, we may actually see them drifting actually out of compliance. So another view of integrity comes down, there we go, comes down to confidentiality, again, being on the security side of the house, and availability typically on the operations side. Sorry, got ahead of myself. And integrity really is the bridge that can help go between those two silos. Now, if we start taking a look at the cyber controls that we would put in place, if we look at virtually any of the frameworks, we can look at CIS, we can look at ISO, there's a set of, or the critical security controls, there's a set of very common elements that really are called out in each of those frameworks, or virtually every framework that's out there. And those come down to really what the critical controls or the foundational controls need to be. To take a look at an example, we can break it out in terms of the categories that are there for knowing what's on your network, being able to protect it. And if you look at the control titles that we would pull out of something like the CIS benchmark, you can see that those things that we would really call the foundational controls deal with at least 5 or 6 of the top CSC 20 type controls. So it is a very well evolved thought that the foundational controls really have to be there and put in place and managed well to be successful in the security, to have a successful security program. So moving forward, or taking a look at what does that mean in what we've seen in the India market. Certainly we had seen the Information Technology Act from 2000 and the subsequent revisions of it. And then there's the upcoming Personal Data Protection Act that is still obviously going through the approval process. But many of the indicators from the Personal Data Protection Act looks like it's going to be based on many of the same principles as the European GDPR regulations. So when we look at that, and what again it calls out is that foundational controls are really the essential building blocks to have an effective security program to address the GDPR requirements. So we think as we see the PDPB, or the Personal Data Protection Act roll out, it's going to be all that much more important to make sure that we have an effective program in place, and that will very much affect the Indian marketplace as that regulation takes in. The other element, of course, that we have to deal with is taking a look at how do we migrate into the cloud environment. And again, it's actually some of the fundamental controls that we've known to use and trust in the enterprise environment are actually equally applicable in the cloud environment. So we tend to get distracted with the born in the cloud and the shiny new objects here that are specific to some cloud technologies. And it's interesting stuff. There's good capabilities there, but again, you have to deal with the very fundamental capabilities. And a good example there would be things like in AWS or Azure, we want to be able to do the equivalent of what we would think of as file integrity management or configuration management to see, have you just modified your AWS buckets and inadvertently exposed something that shouldn't have been exposed. So there are very real configuration or change type events that we need to be on top of in the cloud environment. And a lot of the underlying principles come back to those foundational controls that we've talked about, and that we know we just need to, in many cases, come back and really make sure we shore up those foundational controls before we try and chase some of the other objects. It's interesting, though, when we also take a look at how does the foundational control map against the spend. So there's actually been some interesting studies from IDC that actually map about 12% of the information security budget is being directed towards the foundational controls. And 88% of that is being directed towards other security controls that may be in the environment, may be producing actually less value. So there is a fairly substantial imbalance in terms of the spend to get the controls that are necessary to actually have a secure and effective security management program. So as we're seeing in many customer environments, but not enough, that they are actually taking the time to reinvest in the cyber integrity, or certainly the integrity part of it, and really that translates into the foundationals. So how do they actually end up helping you? So first, foundational controls. There are various studies, but we've actually been tracking one that actually shows that about 91% of the actual conditions that led to a breach could have been detected and prevented with an effective foundational security controls program in place. It is very important for proactive IT management. It is also a big part of solving and being a part of the regulatory requirements, as we've seen here and we have seen elsewhere in the world as it's gone forward. And that was the quick introduction to really bringing a focus back to the fundamental security controls, and certainly hope that that can be a part of your organization, your focus, and help take you into the new compliance frameworks. Anyway, thank you very much.